Hello, everyone. Anyone ever had Topo Chico? I hear a lot about it. Mineral water, carbonated, from Monterrey, Mexico. I've heard it's delicious. It's just carbonated water. There's nothing special about it. I'm drinking it because I did pay $2 for it. And when I opened it, apparently it had been shaken up. So I lost about that much of it on my beard, neck, and chest and shirt. But that's unrelated. So, let's get to this part 2. I didn't go back. I completely lied to you. I was going to go back. I didn't. But, what was it that just happened? Fort Sumter was just attacked. And those guys, you know what, we will go back a little bit. Those guys are marching off to war.
Around, and you'll all have to go back home to your wives and children. But in particular, the South knew the conflict would pose a bit of a challenge. How can we expect to win with a population of only 5 million against 22 million in the North? If you count us 4 million slaves, you'd have 9 million. Great idea. Hand these rifles out to all the Wait a minute. You almost had me there. The problem for Lincoln was that many of his top generals were getting old and were being a bit too cautious. The commanding general was a man named Winfield Scott, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and by now, he was too fat to even mount a horse. Okay, chaps, we need...
To be fair, Winfield Scott was the general during the War of 1812 and stuff. I think that you just said that. He is still considered one of our great generals. Now, I'm not going to rank him, but he's up there. You know, he was a little overweight, and he was near the end of his life anyways. But it's I'm not bashing the guy just because he was near the end of his life and overweight. Put a little respect to him.
To come up with a plan. Hit me. We could wait for the Confederates to come and apologize. Maybe we should all sit in a circle and discuss our feelings. Crossing the Delaware into New Jersey worked for me. Those are all terrible ideas. And you? Wrong video. Hey, I'm the greatest president in the history of this nation. Yeah, we'll see about that, dingus. Eventually, Lincoln's generals came up with a multi-pronged strategy. First, a blockade would cut off and starve the South of supplies by sea. Secondly, taking control of the Great Mississippi River would sever the South's economic artery while splitting it in two. And finally, a main Union force in the east would move south and take the Confederate capital, ending the war. Bada boom, bada bing. Skirmishes began to break out across the nation, and the Union Army in the east began to move south towards Richmond. Everything seemed to be going well until they reached Manassas, where they came upon a large Confederate force. It's almost like they were waiting for us. How did they know? As it turned out, spies in DC had sent a coded message to the Confederates warning of the invasion. Did you use NordVPN? What the heck is NordVPN? I'm so glad you asked. Do you use the internet? Me too. Do you like internet safety? Me too. Hey, we should hang out sometime so I can tell you about NordVPN. NordVPN has over 5,000 secure and super fast servers in 60 countries that allow you to surf the net safely without personal data logging. Use promo code OverSimplified to get 70% off an annual subscription. That's only $3.49 a month plus an additional month for free. Again, that's nordvpn.com/oversimplified. And as always, you'll be supporting my channel. So thank you. Now where were we? Oh yeah, secession, Fat Man, and the Union invasion into Virginia. The two sides encountered each other at Manassas, and both geared up for the first major battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates rapidly brought in support via rail, and the two sides were about equal in numbers. However, they were also equally inexperienced. A large number of civilians also rode out by carriage from DC to picnic on the nearby hills and watch the excitement unfold. Nobody seemed to quite understand how destructive this war was going to be. The Union forces pulled a flanking maneuver to hit the Confederates on their left, and the two sides fired on each other in rows. Farm families living in the area were forced to flee the fighting, including a man named Wilmer McLean. Hurry up, Martha! There's a war out here! The more you tell me to hurry up, the slower I will go! The Union force saw initial success pushing the Confederates back to Henry Hill, but one as of yet fairly unknown General Thomas Jackson had arrived, and he took a defensive position, standing firm like a stone wall, holding the Union Army off, and finally sending them running back to Washington, D.C. With heavy casualties, the sobering reality of war hit both sides hard, and the North, having just lost the first major battle, had to face the serious prospect that they may not actually win this war. President Lincoln, General Jackson whipped us so hard, the Confederates are calling him Stonewall Jackson. Wait, that's why they're calling him that? Not because he looks like he ran face first into a stone wall? Apparently not. Worse yet, the North had also lost the first major battle out west, giving away control of southwest Missouri. All of this was terrible news for Abraham Lincoln, especially since many of his generals and cabinet already didn't have much respect for him. They felt he was incapable of running a war because he seemed a bit like your friendly old grandpa. He famously loved a long-winded story and a good pun. I've been so busy, my wife is missing me, but her aim is starting to improve. But deep down, few realized he could also be incredibly shrewd. Oh, Abe, you're so funny. Funny how? Funny like I'm a clown? Abe, I was just... No, funny how? Like I'm here to amuse you? During the war.
Anyone ever seen the movie Goodfellas? That's a scene from that movie. It's Ray Liotta's character says, "Oh, you're funny," and not Al Pacino, not Robert De Niro. Keep naming people that aren't that guy. Oh my goodness, I can't think of his name. I can see him. He was in Home Alone. Oh my gosh, you guys are yelling at me right now if you know who he is. I could look him up, but I want my brain to work. I keep thinking about, in My Cousin Vinny, he goes, the two Utes. Excuse me, the two what? Two Utes. I'm sorry, the two youths. Oh man. I cannot think of his name. But anyways, that's the scene. It's going to come to me. That's the scene. It's very funny.
Lincoln committed acts that were viewed by some as impeachable. His administration suppressed the free media from printing articles sympathetic towards the South. Some Southern sympathizers were even arrested without a trial. Lincoln's criticizers began accusing him of being a tyrant. But to quote the man himself, "Hey, it's war, baby. What are you going to do?" By the end of 1861,
he bent the rule, the law, the Constitution. He bent it. He did cross the lines. There's one thing in particular that I think is kind of a garbage thing, and that was with Maryland being pretty much surrounding DC. Maryland had I'll say a Democrat for a governor, and this Democrat kind of hinted that he might join the Confederacy. And so what Lincoln did was he allowed soldiers who were Republican to go home and vote. Democrats weren't necessarily given a pass. They had like they were busy. And so the Republicans got the votes to put in a different governor to secure Maryland. You can't do that, but he did.
with things already looking bad for the North, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass couldn't believe that the Union Army weren't enlisting black men. He continued to put pressure on Lincoln to make the war about emancipation. "Mr. President, it's time to make the war about emancipation." I don't want to ruffle any feathers. The feathers are already ruffled. But Lincoln, hanging on to hope for a quick end to the conflict, continued to fight only for the preservation of the Union. It was decided, however, that escaped slaves from the Confederacy could be held as enemy contraband, and many of these men were put to work bolstering the Union's infrastructure and...
Joe Pesci. I just looked it up. I had to. It was annoying me. Joe Pesci was the character. Is the guy that I was thinking of, not the character. He's the guy. He has a great line in that movie that I cannot say. You gonna help me out here, Henry?
Supply lines. Hoping to get things moving, Lincoln made young General George McClellan the new commanding general, and McClellan began to train up his men. He thought a lot of himself, however, and believed he was going to be the nation's great savior. And like many others, he didn't approve of the president's handling of the war. On one occasion,
He was, I will say this, McClellan was the perfect guy for getting the troops trained, getting them ready to fight. They loved him. He treated them well. He was a great builder that way. Putting him in the field of command, though, he just was not good.
Lincoln went to McClellan's house to meet with him, but McClellan was late returning home. He kept the president waiting, and when he finally got there, he just straight up went to bed. Now that's what I call disrespectful. McClellan talked the talk, but could he walk the walk? No. Like Lincoln's other generals, McClellan was maddeningly cautious. Hey man, could you move south and attack the enemy? What? Are you crazy? What if they have a big scary army down there? They probably do. What? Oh my gosh! McClellan worried that he did not have the numbers he needed to fight effectively. What if they have like 10,000 men? Okay, no problem. We'll get you 20,000 men. Well, what if they have 30,000 men? I'll need 40. Okay, you can have 40. Well, what if they have 50? I'll need 60. Lincoln tried, but it was all in vain. McClellan would not make a move for the rest of the year. The North's one saving grace for now was a general out west fighting in Kentucky and Tennessee, General Ulysses S. Grant. Cool, collected, methodical, and a big fan of whiskey. His chief of staff took it upon himself to keep Grant sober. One officer said that Grant habitually wore an expression as though he were determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. And that determination led him to score a number of key victories when others around him were failing. At the Battle of Fort Donelson, Grant was like, "Why does Stonewall Jackson get a cool nickname and I don't? I want a cool nickname." "Sir, the Confederates say they're ready to surrender and want to know your terms." "No terms, just unconditional surrender." Hey, unconditional surrender Grant. That's a pretty cool nickname, right? Guys, right? Later in April 1862, the Confederates launched a sudden attack on Grant's army at Shiloh, but the determined, unconditional surrender Grant threw his lines at the rebels and sent them running.
The battlefield of Shiloh, I toured that. Didn't give enough time to tour it. So I drove around, and there was a lot of stuff that I wanted to see. Didn't give myself enough time. But Shiloh was, I think at the time when it was a battle that I think both sides then realized this is a war, because the Shiloh was brutal and a lot of people died, and it was Grant's, I think, first battle as commander. Like, that wasn't a siege, it was just like an actual battle. I could be mixing something up. Sherman was there, and Sherman came to Grant after the first day of war and said, "We've had the devil's own day." And Grant just smoking his cigar, just looking over the battlefield, and he just says, "Yeah, lick him tomorrow, though." And that was his attitude. Like, yeah, you got us day one, but...
Battle resulted in the heaviest casualties in U.S. history so far. And despite his victory, Grant found himself under fire. You have to get rid of Grant. Why? Didn't he win? Yes, but he just threw his men at the enemy. Isn't that the point? Also, he's a loony drunk. Well, what does he like to drink? I believe whiskey, sir. Then send him more. Lincoln watched as his cabinet did nothing but bicker.
That's actually a true statement, by the way, from Lincoln. He asked what he why, and they were like, "Oh, he's a drunk. He drinks a lot." And he was like, "Well, what does he drink?" And they were like, "Whiskey." And he's like, "Well, make sure we send him more bottles. Whatever it takes to keep winning the war. To turn the tide, just to win." That was important to him.
And his generals did nothing. But then, worst of all, personal tragedy struck. Lincoln's young son, Willie, very much loved by the president, died of typhoid fever at the age of 11. Lincoln was a sensitive man and was heavily affected by the loss. His wife was inconsolable. But one of Lincoln's greatest traits, what made him such a great leader, was in the darkest of times, with composure and determination, he kept moving forward. He knew it was his responsibility to hold himself and his family together, and by doing so, he hoped to hold the nation together. And he had had it with McClellan's inaction. Lincoln decided he was going to take control. In March 1862, Lincoln firmly ordered McClellan to once again move south towards Richmond. McClellan insisted instead they move by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and attack Richmond from the southeast. Yes, said Lincoln. Okay, anything. Lincoln held on to some of McClellan's men to defend D.C. from a nearby Stonewall Jackson wreaking havoc in the Shenandoah Valley, and he sent McClellan south. McClellan landed on the peninsula, and he began to move inland. He came up against a small Confederate army that had dug in at Yorktown. McClellan vastly outnumbered the force, but it's said that Confederate General Magruder deceived McClellan by cleverly maneuvering his smaller force and making McClellan believe he faced a huge army. No, you have way more men than them. Move forward. No. McClellan settled in for a month-long siege, giving time for Johnston to move south from Manassas and Magruder time to retreat. When he finally entered the city and found it deserted, he declared it a victory, calling his success brilliant. Then, after meeting some resistance at Williamsburg, McClellan moved to within just 20 miles of Richmond, his armies able to hear the church bells ringing in the enemy capital. You still outnumber them. Go give them hell. No. McClellan once again held back, moving slowly and defensively, and with his army split in two, the Confederates saw an opportunity to strike back. McClellan's advance was halted, and now the Confederates pulled an ace out of their sleeve. General Lee, you're up. Do you think we should evacuate Richmond? No, Mr. President, no need. General Robert E. Lee, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the time, was now in charge. One of his biggest strengths was his ability to read the mind of his enemy, and he knew McClellan was cautious and weak. After moving Stonewall Jackson south to join him, and even though he had a smaller army, Lee hit McClellan in a series of fast-paced, close combat battles that had McClellan spooked. McClellan retreated the Union Army back again and again and again, escaping the peninsula and returning to D.C. Lee had defeated McClellan, and the campaign had failed. Well, that was a major success. A success? Tell me exactly what was successful about that. Well, we successfully retreated. You lost. I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. Things just kept looking worse for the North. At least their Navy had seen some success, capturing a number of key port cities, notably when they steamrolled past Confederate forts to take New Orleans. And speaking of the Navy, both sides had begun using ironclads. So that's pretty cool. But in the East, they still weren't having any luck. After McClellan's disastrous campaign, Lincoln briefly sent out one General John Pope to attack Northern Virginia. Hey man, just checking in. How's it going? Well, the Confederates kicked my butt at Cedar Mountain. Then they raided my camp and ran off with my money and clothes. Also, I appear to have been wedgied. Lee defeated Pope at yet another battle at Bull Run, in which nearby farm families once again got caught up in the fighting. Hurry up, Martha! There's another war out here! I'm waiting for my hair to dry! Wilmer McLean, sick of war, moved his family south, where he knew the war would definitely, absolutely, never touch him again. But Lincoln had yet another problem to contend with. European powers, in particular the UK, were looking increasingly like they may intervene diplomatically on the side of the Confederates. They were missing their precious supply of southern cotton because of the Union blockade, and they wanted to see a swift conclusion to the war. The tension between America and Great Britain had been increasing, especially after Confederate diplomats were discovered on a British ship. Now, after McClellan's failure to take Richmond, the UK declared it impossible for the North to win. Lincoln needed something to prevent Europe from getting involved, and after more petitioning from abolitionists, he decided maybe the time was finally right to make.
One of the things when they discovered the two Confederates on the British ship, the Union, the North, had them arrested, and the British found out and demanded that they be released, because if not, you took them off of our ship, which is kind of funny when you think about it, because they used to stop American ships in the early days of the country. They used to stop and just impress soldiers because of wars they were fighting, and suddenly they had a problem with us arresting them. Okay. So anyways, they basically made a threat of war. And Lincoln, very wisely, knowing we can't fight two wars, We can't fight the Confederates and then try to take on England. It's not going to work. So he told his guys to release him, and then told his cabinet, who were just like, yeah, we'll fight the whole world. He was like, one war at a time. So that was another kind of soothing thing, but it was close. But yeah, he calmed him down.
The war about ending the institution he hated, slavery. If the North had a noble cause to fight for, Europe would be less likely to intervene. But Lincoln and his cabinet knew before they could declare something as radical as emancipation, they needed a victory, especially now that the Confederates were about to go on the attack. Aware that he had a limited number of men and supplies, Lee now hoped that if he could just threaten Washington, D.C. militarily, he would gain Europe's recognition and crush Northern morale in time for the midterm elections, forcing the North to negotiate. With confidence at an all-time high, for the first time, Robert E. Lee invaded the North. But on September 13th, the North finally had some luck. Oh boy, it's my lucky day! A cigar in a field. Hey, what's this wrapped around it? Oh my gosh! That's right, the North had discovered General Lee's battle plans wrapped around some cigars. And in them, they saw that Lee had split up his forces. McClellan headed out from D.C., and the two sides met in the Battle of Antietam, a crucial battle that would decide the course of the war. It saw the most vicious fighting to date, and still remains the single bloodiest day in American history. But, for once, the North came out victorious, and Lee was forced to retreat. He's on the run. Chase him down and finish him off. No. You know what, old buddy, old pal? You're fired. The North had won their crucial victory. Lincoln breathed a huge sigh of relief, and with that win, he was prepared to take a huge step. On September 22nd, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. In January, all slaves held in the Confederate States would be, as far as the U.S. government was concerned, officially free. Throughout the North, free black men and women rejoiced, knowing that if the North were to win, their brothers and sisters would no longer be held in bondage. The proclamation also had the intended effect on Europe, who were not willing to oppose a pledge to end slavery. An outraged Confederacy knew that Lincoln had given the war a new meaning. It was no longer just about the preservation of the Union. Now, it was about creating a new Union, washed clean of its original sin. A Union without slavery.
One thing that gets left out, which I find pretty fascinating, is when all of this was happening, excuse me, it wasn't Nicholas. Was it Alexander? I apologize for not knowing this, but the Tsar at that time, England, France, and Spain were all looking at the U.S., trying to figure out about stepping in and all this and that, and ending the conflict, but for their own greed. The Tsar had a problem with France, I believe, at the time. Well, Russia at the time. And as a kind of middle finger to France, he notified the U.S. that he was sending ships to protect the Union. And Lincoln was like, no, you don't have to do that. And the response was, I already did, and they're there. And there had been a few ships, not meddling or anything, but they were nearby, figuring that if a war was started by those three countries to try to intercede, they were going to get involved. And it's a very small thing, but I find it very interesting that it gets left out, because it's a very cool thing that Russia did that. We're going to end the video here, and we will go back for part 2. Is like 22 minutes, so that'll just be one video. And sorry, very thirsty now. That carbonated water didn't help me. So we're going to end this here. There's a thanks button. You can donate to the channel. You don't have to. Subscribe. That helps me. Hit that bell. That helps you and helps me. Man, I'm coughing again. Give a thumbs up, because why would you watch the videos and not do it? And give a thumbs down if you like to put your thumb in your booty hole. How about that? Have a good day. Have a good night.